Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be looking at another article. We're going to analyze this article from Fox News, written by J. Warner Wallace, and it's entitled, Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church. And he talks about why they're doing that, and it's a topic that we want to cover because this is something very, very important. Why are young Christians leaving the church? And he's going to explain why. And I don't have to tell you that more and more and more of the younger generation are checking out of church. They're not bothering to go on Sunday morning. They're dropping church altogether. A lot of times they don't even show up on Christmas. They don't show up on Easter. They just are making faith irrelevant. And we have to understand why they are and what the polling data understands and see if we can figure out a way to speak to young people, to show them that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and only through Jesus is their life here and now, and also eternal life. So we have to really show them. So let me get into the article. Young Christians are leaving the church. Here's why, according to J. Warner Wallace, and I'll comment on this. A new 2018 Pew Research Center report polled a growing group of America, religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. This group describes themselves as nothing in particular when asked if they identify with a specific religious group. The vast majority are ex-Christians, and most are under the age of 35. Pew asked a representative sample of these religious nuns why they now reject any religious affiliation and provided respondents with 6 possible responses. According to the Pew report, most religious nuns left because they question a lot of religious teachings. 51% agreed with this statement. Or because they don't like the positions churches take on social political issues. 46% agreed with this statement. To a lesser extent, nuns agreed with the statement, I don't like religious organizations, 34%. I don't like religious leaders, 31%. Or religion is irrelevant to me, 26%. From this data, one might infer that Christians leave the faith because they no longer agree with the teachings of the church or they don't like religious organizations or leaders. But this is not why young Christians are leaving the church. So J. Warner Wallace is going to try to go a little deeper, and he's claiming that the surveys don't tell you why. They just get to the surface level as to what people say that they're leaving the church for. And the young people are asked a certain number of options, and they say, okay, pick which one that best describes you. And J. Warner Wallace is going to say that is not a good way because you need to let them say in their own words why they're leaving the church. He says one glaring statistic was largely overlooked in the latest data collected by the Pew Research Center. When religious nuns were asked to identify the most important reason for not affiliating with a religion, the largest response was that none of the 6 responses provided by the Pew were actually very important. In the poll, Pew did not allow respondents to answer in their own words. So even though the respondents searched for an answer that approximated their experience, most didn't believe that any of the reasons offered by Pew were very important to them when deciding to abandon their religious identity. What then is the real reason why young people leave the faith? The answer lies in a prior 2016 Pew Research survey, which allowed respondents to answer their own question. In this study, most nuns said they no longer identified with a religious group because they no longer believed it was true. When asked why they didn't believe, many said their view about God had evolved. Quote, some reported having a crisis of faith. Their specific explanations following statements. Quote, learning about evolution when I went away to college. Quote, religion is the opiate of the people. That's a quote from Karl Marx. Quote, rational thought makes religion go out the window. Quote, lack of any sort of scientific or specific evidence of a creator. Quote, I just realized somewhere along the line that I didn't really believe. quote, I'm doing a lot more learning, studying, and kind of making decisions myself rather than listening to someone else. So these are some of the top objections to Christian teenagers, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, when they walk out the door of the church and don't come back, and basically identify with that new rising category called nones, N-O-N-E-S. And the reasons they give, and evolution is up there at the top. Religion makes religion go out the window. That's a popular sentiment. And these are some of the things that you will hear people say to you, if they even give a reason. Okay, the data from this 2016 study may explain why ex-Christians question a lot of religious teachings, as reported on the 28 study. The teaching they question seems to be about the existence of God, and this is consistent with the explanations offered by ex-Christians in a variety of other recent studies. When Christians walk away from the faith, more often than not, it's due to some form of intellectual skepticism. Ex-Christians often describe religious belief as innately blind or unreasonable. Now, one of the problems that we see here is that apparently these ex-Christians or young people who have abandoned the faith, apparently they were never given a proper intellectual and mature grounding of the faith to begin with. So what was it that they were given all throughout their church attendance? What was it they were given in Sunday school? What was it that they were given in their small groups? What was it that they were doing when they went to church all those many years before they decided to just walk away? Well, what they've usually experienced in churches is a community of people. So there's the social part of it. Friends, they go to talk to their friends, they go to meet with their friends to discuss things, but not anything deep. And that's the problem. It's all very superficial. A lot of times, the worship in their church is highly experiential. It's highly heavy music, heavy contemporary Christian, where the content of theology and the Bible and a lot of the deeper doctrines are not even talked about. It's more of kind of a feeling good about God and feeling good about the world and feeling good about other people. So there's a heavy experiential, touchy-feely part of their church experience that doesn't give them the proper foundation for facing the difficulties in life later on. And so when problems come up, the only thing they have is this sort of good feeling that they've gotten at their church. And what about the sermons? What about the messages? Are there messages that they've received grounded in the Bible? And are they intellectual enough so that when they have these questions, they can go and get the resources that they need? Are the pastors up in the pulpit on Sunday morning helping people who go out into the secular, humanistic, atheistic world? Are the pastors preaching sermons about the topics that are being talked about in the work office or at school, in the classrooms, and so on and so forth? Quite often, no. For example, if you go to some of the biggest megachurches in the United States, and you would attend on a weekly basis, and then someone were to ask you, if you just attended those megachurches on Sunday morning, would you know that the Western world and the United States in particular is going through this immoral revolution presently, where in, say, for example, in the 1950s, you had a very stable population. The Judeo-Christian moral ethic was more or less practiced by everyone, not even necessarily just Christians, but everyone, because that was the Western world fail-safe, default, moral standard, Judeo-Christian. But during the 60s revolution, sexual revolution in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and we are at a point right now that our Western civilization has basically thrown out the Judeo-Christian moral ethic. Now, in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, we have thrown out the Judeo-Christian marriage standard. And now marriage is no longer a man and a woman, but our society, our people, especially young people, have been taught not only by the high court, but by universities, professors, the media, Hollywood, music industry, entertainment industry. They've been taught that a marriage can be between 2 men and 2 women. So the whole idea of marriage and the foundation pillar of the society, marriage, has been upended. Now, if you were to attend a megachurch during the last 3 or 4 years, would you know that there was an immoral revolution taking place in society? And the answer is probably not. And the reason is because the megachurches have positioned themselves as an escape from the culture wars. They position themselves as a safe haven from anything that's controversial. And so when you go into, for example, Joel Osteen's church, the biggest church in the United States down in Texas, you will not hear about the biblical standards of marriage and the opposition to the new redefinition of marriage. You will not hear sermons dealing with that issue, even though it's in front page headlines, even though it's in the front page in textbooks and all these things. You will not hear that in the megachurches because they don't want to alienate people. They don't want to offend people, and so they stay clear of that. Well, this is one of the problems. If we don't teach young people what the truth is and then contrast it with error, and if we're not courageous enough and brave enough to be willing to offend people, the only thing they're going to hear is this feel-good message of, Jesus loves you, this I know, for the Bible tells me so, and that's it. And you can't build a life simply on a surface level theology. You have to go deeper than that. So let's see what J. Warner Wallace says, and I think he's going to basically say the same thing. The data from the 2016 study may explain why ex-Christians questioning a lot of religious teachings as reported in 2018. Okay, we said that, but that doesn't accurately reflect the rich evidential history of Christianity. The psalmist appealed to the design and fine-tuning of the universe to demonstrate the existence of God. Jesus appealed to both eyewitness testimony and the indirect evidence of his miracles to argue for the authority of his statements. The disciples identified themselves as eyewitnesses and appealed to their observations of the resurrection to make the case for the deity of Christ. Ex-Christians often leave the church because they don't think anyone in the church can answer their questions or make a case. It's time for believers to accept their responsibility to explain what Christianity proposes and why these propositions are true, especially when interacting with young people who have legitimate questions. Rather than embracing a blind or unreasonable faith, Christians must develop an informed forensic faith that can stand up in the marketplace of ideas. We know why young Christians are leaving. Now it's time to give them a reason to stay. So that's a very good and helpful article by J. Warner Wallace, and it's dealing with that whole issue of why young Christians are leaving the church. Now, one of the fears, like I said, of churches, it's the megachurch have a huge fear of this because they don't want thousands and thousands of people to leave the church. And you have to admit that when you bring up the topic politics and religion, you are going to offend some people. So, what do you do when these questions need to be answered? Churches need to be addressing these questions. They need to be teaching why marriage is a man and a woman. They need to be teaching why families function best when there's a man in the house and a woman in the house, where there's a mother there, where there's a father there. Children thrive in a two-parent household, a man and a woman. The churches more or less don't want to get into these hotbed political issues because they think they're going to alienate people in the church. And the thing about it is they are going to be alienating people in the church whenever you talk about these topics. But the only other alternative is to not talk about those topics, but then you're going to turn people away, because when they get out into the real world, they're not going to have the answers to these questions. And so what churches need to do is they need to go ahead and address these topics, but they need to do so in the best possible way so as not to alienate the people in the process. The solution is not to talk about topics that might offend people. The solution is to talk about them, but try to talk about them in a way that doesn't unduly or unnecessarily offend people who are attending in the churches today. But what has happened in the last 20, 30 years is that because of the marketing surveys and the polling data, and because of the information that church leaders have gotten from people like the Pew polling company, is that they shouldn't be controversial. They shouldn't bring up issues that might offend people. But the problem with that is churches have taken that message and said, okay, well, then we better not talk about this. We better not talk about this. We better not talk about this. But those are the very questions that people ask, especially the young people. And so when you say we're not going to talk about those, we're not going to get into that subject because we're going to offend people, we're going to alienate people, people will leave the church, you're basically saying the only thing we're going to deal with are topics that everyone can agree with are important and everyone can agree with that they want to hear. And so you're cutting out all kinds of very, very, very important topics that need to be talked about, and there needs to be a clear biblical message about them, the topics, and we need to teach the Bible and not worry about what's going to happen when we teach the Bible. I think a lot of churches, the pastors at least, are too obsessed and they're too fixated on not driving people out of the church. After all, most church leaders are interested in growing a congregation, not dispersing a congregation. And most church leaders, elders and deacons and people who are affiliated with the church in responsible positions of leadership in the church, they want more people to come into the church from the community, not exit the church. And so they think, well, if we talk about these issues, let's look at some of those questions that the young people were saying why they left. Learning about evolution when I went away to college. Okay, churches, even mega churches, need to talk about the creation and why evolution, the macro theory, the big theory, the grand theory, Darwin's theory, why that is wrong. They need to talk about that and be fair about why the Bible teaches different than what they're learning in the college textbooks. And answer questions and have people even from outside, experts come in from outside and give talks and address this question, because if they try to ignore it, then the people in the church will just go out and they'll go to the bookstores and they'll go online and they'll just read this information unedited, and they'll get into wrong sources. They'll be listening to the wrong authorities. And 9 times out of 10, if you read something about evolution from the secular perspective, it's going to be highly supportive of even the grand theory, Darwin's theory. So you have to be very specific and say, okay, we're going to call in the experts in the Christian world, and we're going to explain why the Darwinian theory of evolution has problems, and plant those seeds of doubt into the young people's minds as far as Darwin's theory. Then another reason, it says religion is the opiate of the people. Now, I said before, that's a quote from Karl Marx. And young people go to college and they learn Karl Marx's attitude toward all faith. And they learn his attitude toward God. They learn his criticism of religion. But do they get the counter rebuttal to Karl Marx's charges? Usually not. And so churches have to address that and say, you know, atheists believe this. Why are they wrong? Here's why they're wrong. And explain why they're wrong. It says here, rational thought makes religion go out the window. Again, that is the mantra of the atheists today and the college professors who are atheists. And the mantra is that when you start using your brain, you stop using faith. You can either think your way through life, or you can just believe your way through life based on the Bible and the Christian faith. And the message in college and in the secular media and in even the government now is that it's better to think your way through life rather than believe your way through life. It's better to trust in yourself, they say, than to trust in God or the Bible. And so churches need to explain to people why trusting in yourself is futile, while trusting in yourself is foolish. And if you just trust in yourself, you're going to come to destruction. That needs to be addressed. It says another one, I just realized somewhere along the line that I didn't really believe it. Well, if the only thing you've been given is this Sunday school childlike picture of God, and there's been no deeper, meaningful teaching on the subject, yeah, you're going to then take that childish faith in God, which is good for a child. You know, a child who has a childlike faith is good because they're children and they need to have some kind of a faith, and the only faith a child can have is a childlike faith. But if you take that childlike faith and you don't grow in it, and you're an adult now, and you go out into the world with that childish faith, then you're not going to be able to survive, and you're going to walk away from the church. And that's basically what has happened to a lot of young people, just as the title of this article says, young Christians are leaving the church. Here's why. The basic reason why they're leaving the church, it boils down to this. They are taking a childish faith into an adult world. And the childish faith is not standing up to the adult attacks of the secularists, the atheists, other religions, no religions, science, secular science, atheistic science, materialistic science. The childlike faith that they had in church that was not matured, that was not grown up, that can't stand in the world. You have to have an adult-sized faith. You have to have a mature faith, or else you won't make it. So that's what's basically at root here. Finally, the last one, I'm doing a lot more learning, studying, and kind of making decisions myself rather than listening to someone else. Okay, now, churches need to challenge that and say, okay, people are making decisions for themselves without reference to the Bible or Christian faith. Where has that gotten them? People are making decisions about marriage. Where has that gotten them? We have almost at this point in our culture a near collapse of marriage. at least half of all marriages fail. Why? Why is that happening? It didn't happen before. All the centuries before the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, all the centuries before, people got married and they pretty much stayed married the whole lifetime. Now, why is it that marriage is collapsing? Why is it that families are breaking up? Well, one of the big reasons is this very attitude. I'm doing a lot more learning and studying and kind of making decisions myself rather than listening to someone else. That's a good definition of a fool, when they don't listen to someone else, especially if that someone else is God. If you're not listening to the Bible, you're not listening to God. If you're not following the Bible, you're not following God. And where has that gotten people? It's gotten us to the point where we're in a moral state of chaos right now. The suicide rate is high. It's climbing. People don't know how to handle their problems. People sense that they need to get married, but then when they get married, it blows up, and half of all marriages end in divorce. And then the half that stays together, half of those are barely staying together. So what is the problem there? It's that they're not following the wisdom of God, and they're following their own understanding. The Bible teaches in Proverbs, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean to your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, that is God, and he will direct your path, or he will make your path straight. So we need to, as the churches, we need to take a more adversarial view of culture. One of the problems with the big mega churches and even the smaller churches now that try to copy them is that they want to be on friendly terms with the pagan, sinful, secular culture. And the culture is just attacking and beating up on the church and lying about the church and trying to tear it down at every point. And the church is smiling and acting like nobody's trying to kill it and nobody's trying to hurt it. And it's trying to take this very friendly view of culture, when in fact, as a church, we need to say, we live in a time when our culture has gone insane. It has gone off the rails. It is disintegrating. It is dying. It is decaying. And the only hope for this culture is Jesus Christ and his church. And so when you stay with Christianity, you're staying with sanity. You're staying with wisdom. You're staying with the only way to make it in life. So we need to actually teach the positive Christian message and also critique the negative, destructive sinfulness of our culture. And we need to do that to build up strong people so they don't walk away when they get older. Well, I hope that's been a helpful analysis of our culture today, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ and Culture. God bless.